It was just about 2 years ago that the University of California Press published the first very large volume of Mark Twain's autobiography. And although I had been familiar with Twain's autobiography for years, when I bought that volume and started reading through it, I was actually struck all over again by the degree of anger that Twain displays in that book. And of course, a lot of the anger is directed at former business associates. He had a tendency to break off with people and then blame them for everything that had ever happened in his life that was bad. But a surprising amount is also aimed at American domestic politics and at American foreign policy. So for instance, are you hearing me if I move away from this? For instance, at one point, Twain suddenly segues from talking about his childhood memories to talking about the events of the day on which he was giving the dictation for the autobiography. The newspapers had just reported that the American Army had just massacred a tribe of Filipinos who had taken refuge in the crater of a volcano in the southern Philippines. So this was happening in 1906, which was 7 years after the US government had decided that it was America's duty to annex the Philippines and I'm quoting President McKinley here, to civilize and Christianize the Filipinos and to do the very best we could by them as our fellow men for whom Christ also died. So McKinley's decision had marked America's entry into the community of imperialist nations, and it brought the United States its first taste of prolonged guerrilla warfare with nationalists who demanded their right to govern their own country. Twain had opposed annexation in 1899. And in his 1906 dictation, he focuses on the ways that American newspapers were celebrating the victory over the Filipinos, a battle that he points out, in which the army, armed with modern weapons, stood on the edge of the crater and shot down, killing 600 men, women, and children. Twain was especially critical of Teddy Roosevelt's celebration of this act. After the killing was finished, President Roosevelt publicly congratulated the battalion for its brilliant feat of arms and for upholding the honor of the American flag. And Twain was horrified by Roosevelt's hypocrisy. At first, he responded satirically. The massacre of hundreds of poorly armed Filipinos, he suggested, was incomparably the greatest victory that was ever achieved by the Christian soldiers of the United States. And then, just in case his readers didn't get it, he turned from satire to direct attack. Roosevelt, Twain claims, knew perfectly well that to pen 600 helpless and weaponless savages in a hole like rats and massacre them in detail during the stretch of a day and a half was no brilliant feat of arms, and would not have been a brilliant feat of arms even if Christian America had shot them down with Bibles and the Golden Rule instead of bullets. He knew perfectly well that our uniformed assassins had not upheld the honor of the American flag, but they had done as they had been doing continuously for 8 years in the Philippines, that is to say, they had dishonored the flag. So, as you can hear in passages like this, Twain uses his extraordinary verbal dexterity not for humor, but for frontal attack. And this is a Mark Twain that many people don't know. I began exploring this Mark Twain about 8 years ago when I found myself teaching to the person sitting in darkness the week that the United States invaded Iraq. I'd always known that Twain had a rough final decade, But I'd accepted the prevailing view that it came from his anger, basically came from personal, financial, and family problems. But suddenly I began to suspect that it might be rooted in his patriotism rather than in his personal life. And I began to realize that, in fact, Twain cared so deeply about his country's honor that he felt compelled to protest when he felt that it had been betrayed. The risks were high. Critics of foreign policy were being labeled as traitors. And Twain's attacks on the government could have very badly damaged his reputation. And that they didn't, I think, is testament to the number of Americans who were also very upset about the way their country was pursuing its course. And so that brings us to the Twain I want to talk about this afternoon, the morally engaged Twain. Twain, the critic of American foreign policy. So you may be thinking, why on earth should we care about a comic writer's view of American foreign policy 100 years ago? I hope my talk will answer that question. Up front, I want to say that I think we should care because Mark Twain is us, both as a patriot and as a critic of the course his country was taking. We should care because the events he observed anticipate the events of our lives, and because the policies he formulated then laid the groundwork for American policies of the 20th century. Moreover, they're still with us, as are our concerns about their effects on our international reputation. And we should care because Twain's astute understanding of why the U.S. was doing what it was doing then can help us understand why we quarrel so bitterly with each other today. And so I'm going to talk about Twain's responses to the Spanish-American and Philippine-American Wars of 1898 and 1899. So a little background for those of us who have forgotten our 11th grade American history, and I have a feeling that this is one of the few audiences that has not, but we're moving on. And I also want to say a note about the PowerPoint presentation. Most of the slides here come from cartoons that were produced during the period. They reflect both sides of the issues, and I think they give a pretty good visual image of the ways that the conversations were actually going. And I also should warn you that many of them are incredibly racist, which is part of what makes them so interesting. So, history. The Spanish-American War occurred in 1898. That's the war in which Teddy Roosevelt, symbolized by the Rough Riders, invaded Cuba and helped the Cuban revolutionaries free themselves from Spain. The Philippine-American War followed directly after it. People often fuse the two wars because at first the Philippine situation looked a lot like Cuba. Americans helping two Spanish colonies free themselves from Spain. But as time went on, it became clear that there were huge differences. Americans appeared to have initiated the Cuban War from the best of intentions, as the act of a friendly neighbor coming to the aid of Cubans in their struggle against an oppressive colonial power. And in fact, the majority of Americans supported that war. But they did not support it because they wanted to annex the island. Rather, they responded to the Cubans' call for help because they saw the Cuban situation through the lens of their own national history, as a colony in which patriots were fighting for freedom from an oppressive mother country. From this point of view, America's own colonial history made it a natural ally for rebels against colonial rule throughout the world. Twain, who was living in Italy at the time, shared his compatriot's sense of moral obligation. I come across no end of people who simply cannot see the Cuba situation as America sees it. People who cannot believe that any conduct can justify one nation interfering with the domestic affairs of another. he wrote. From the beginning, the family have been rabid opponents of this war, and I've been just the other way. So for Twain, the justification for the invasion rested on America's duty to help struggling colonies achieve freedom and self-rule. So what's the relation between Cuba and the Philippines? Like Cuba, the Philippine archipelago was a Spanish colony, heavily dependent on the mother country politically and on the Roman Catholic Church for almost all its institutions. Spanish was the official language, and with the exception of the Muslim Moros in the south, native Filipinos were almost all Roman Catholic. And the church's tremendous institutional power in the archipelago was a central issue in the Filipino nationalist campaign for self-determination. José Rizal, a 19th century Filipino novelist and revolutionary, featured church corruption in his immensely influential novel, Noli Me Tangere. Noli Me Tangere not only made Rizal a national spokesman, it also introduced the rest of the world to the Filipinos' point of view. This included Twain. He read the novel in an English translation. The Filipinos rebelled against Spain in the 1890s. The Spanish made the great mistake of executing Rizal, and thus the revolutionaries gained a martyr. By 1897, the rebels had declared a Philippine republic with Emilio Aguinaldo as its president. For the nationalists, the goal was self-rule and self-determination. But powerful lobbies within the United States saw another scenario for the archipelago. American merchants were reaching out to new markets. It's one of my favorite cartoons. And the prospect of a commercial foothold in the Pacific was very attractive. Ultimately, the goal was increasing trade with China. Sound familiar? Teddy Roosevelt, at that point Assistant Secretary of the Navy, had the foresight to see that in chasing Spain from the Philippines would put the US into competition with the European nations that were busily dividing up the world among themselves. And the competitive edge would make the US a world power. Roosevelt liked that idea. After the US had invaded Cuba, Roosevelt ordered George Dewey, Commodore of the US Navy in the Pacific, to go to the Philippines and attack the Spanish squadrons stationed in Manila Bay. Dewey sank the entire fleet. Spain capitulated quickly, and the Treaty of Paris, signed by the US and Spain in December of 1898, Spain yielded nearly all the remnants of her former empire to the US: Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. But though Roosevelt and the newspapers glorified the victory, not all Americans were happy about gaining the Philippines. The Treaty of Paris was a highly problematic document. For starters, the Filipino nationalists hated it. From their perspective, it had betrayed them. They had actively assisted Dewey in taking Manila because they believed that the Americans wanted to help them achieve independence. According to Aguinaldo, Dewey had assured him that the US was not interested in assuming control of the archipelago. And so when the nationalists realized that the Americans had no intention of leaving, they rekindled their revolutionary struggle, this time against the Americans. From the Americans' perspective, the problem from the treaty was that it brought the United States to the brink of overseas empire, and many citizens were not at all sure that the country should take the leap. A law passed the previous year prevented annexation of Cuba, but said nothing about the other islands. On the one hand, as Roosevelt understood, the islands, and particularly the Philippines, could be important for American trade and global positioning. The British encouraged the U.S. to annex. British imperialists saw an American presence in the Pacific as a means of bolstering Britain's own interests in the Far East. Rudyard Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden, expressly urged the U.S. to help shoulder the burden of spreading Anglo-Saxon civilization around the globe. And that's another one of my favorite. There's John Bull in the forefront and Uncle Sam in the background, climbing up the mountain through all of the problems of the world to civilization at the top, and carrying on their back all of the peoples of the world that they were colonizing. Right? But many Americans were daunted by the prospect of assuming responsibility for the Philippines, where more than 100 indigenous languages were spoken as well as Spanish, and where only a small percentage of Filipinos had been permitted access to higher education or to European culture. The popular image of Filipinos in the United States painted them as savages, uncivilized and inassimilable. This left Congress furiously debating what it was going to do with the islands, a problem complicated by the fact that most U.S. citizens had no idea where the Philippines or Guam actually were. The period between the signing of the Treaty of Paris in December of 1898 and its very narrow, by one vote, ratification by Congress on February 6, 1899, was thick with debates about religious and racial pluralism in the United States, the role of commerce in the shaping of American identity, and the nature of American citizenship. Mark Twain opposed annexation, but not at first. At first, he thought we would do in the Philippines what we had done in Cuba. I thought it would be a grand idea to put a miniature constitution in the Pacific and start a brand new republic in the Philippines, he told reporters. However, events made him change his mind. I have thought some more since then, and I have read carefully the Treaty of Paris, and I have seen that we do not intend to free, but to subjugate the peoples of the Philippines. We have gone there to conquer, not to redeem. And so, I am an anti-imperialist. So the reason that Twain supported the Cuba project is that, like most of his contemporaries, he originally believed that the U.S. had a duty to spread its form of constitutional liberties to colonies who were struggling for self-rule. Now, this belief was grounded in the national history that Twain, like most Americans, had been taught. And this history located American liberties in Protestant American culture. American history texts of the 19th century almost universally conflate New England history and national history. Because New England was settled by English Protestants who saw their mission into the wilderness as divinely guided, and because the textbooks tended to be produced in New England, the books posit the United States as God's chosen nation. They claim the Bill of Rights as a Protestant document, and they position the Founding Fathers as the directors of the divine mission. And this was the national narrative that the young Samuel Clemens imbibed, even though he went to school in Missouri rather than in New England. But the adult Mark Twain traveled extensively. Over his life, he lived in at least 5 states and visited many more. He also lived in England, Austria, Germany, and Italy. In the mid-1890s, he went on a lecture trip around the world, visiting Australia, New Zealand, Tasmania, India, Ceylon, and South Africa. He read newspapers avidly. He attended parliamentary debates. He talked with intellectuals, politicians, heads of state. He read histories and philosophies, poems and novels, plays and interviews. He observed, he pondered, and he judged. Keenly aware of his country's faults, he nevertheless concluded that the U.S. was superior to other nations because of its history of constitutional freedoms. When the U.S. refrained from annexing Cuba, he believed we had acted in accord with our mission. And then Congress voted to annex the Philippines. Twain's reading had a lot to do with his changing perspective. Twain read José Rizal's Noli Me Tangere in the late 1890s. This book not only educated Twain about the Filipinos, it also reinforced his always latent anti-Catholicism. Rizal, the Filipino nationalist who had been martyred by the Spaniards in 1896. Rizal had written Noli Me Tangere as a protest against Spanish misrule in the archipelago, and in particular, it attacks the Catholic friars who controlled ordinary Filipinos' lives. It portrayed them as almost universally corrupt. They keep mistresses, they abuse children entrusted to them, and they resist reform. The important thing for us to note about Noli Me Tangere is that Rizal's portrayal of the friars confirmed mainstream American sentiment about the Roman Catholic Church. We have to remember that 19th century United States was overtly, virulently anti-Catholic. And we also need to remember that Samuel Clemens grew up in the midst of that anti-Catholicism and that he never quite got over it. Like many Americans, Twain's distrust of the church meant that on some level, he originally understood the Spanish-American War as a continuation of the Reformation, when, he had been taught to believe, Protestant freedoms struggled against Roman Catholic tyranny. Tracing his own lineage from British Protestants, it wasn't difficult for Twain to assume that in chasing Spain out of the New World altogether, the U.S. was wrapping up a hemispheric struggle that had begun 300 years before. He also thought that the U.S. presence as a Protestant nation would break the church's power in the Philippines. But he soon discovered that he was wrong. First of all, the Treaty of Paris allowed the Catholic friars to keep their lands. Even worse, the U.S. partnered with the Sultan of Sulu, head of the Muslim minority in the South, who, among other things, practiced slavery. For Twain, this clinched it. As far as U.S. global positioning was concerned, he saw his country as having traded its honor for what he labeled a backseat in the community of imperialist nations. Well, Mark Twain had a temper, and he did not take disillusionment easily. When he realized that the U.S. wanted to control the Filipinos rather than free them, he reacted with characteristic violence. This is nowhere more evident than in a poem that he wrote in response to U.S. strategies in the Philippines. So we've got Kipling on the one hand writing The White Man's Burden, urging the U.S. to annex the Philippines. We've got Twain responding in many ways with a poem against it. Not only does this poem illustrate his anger, it also demonstrates the depth of his patriotism and his comprehension of the impact of annexation on America's international reputation. Twain's poem takes its title from the English translation of a poem that José Rizal wrote on the eve of his execution. Rizal's poem directly addresses his countrymen, telling them not to mourn him because he is honored to take his place beside other fallen freedom fighters, because for whom morir es descansar, to die is to rest. Twain used the poem's English title, My Last Thought, as a title for his own poem. But Twain's poem is about dishonor, not honor. It's a meditation on the damage that annexation of the Philippines has inflicted on America's moral fiber and its reputation in the world. As in Rizal's poem, Twain's speaker directly addresses his readers. But Twain's speaker is no hero. He is a dying American president who realizes that he has betrayed his country. The president writhes with guilt over having taken the wrong turn. He recalls the honor that he had earned when he helped Cuba to freedom, and he then bitterly admits that his betrayal of the Philippines has replaced the precious laurel I had earned, and in its place I set this poor tin glory, now my wear, of world power, conqueror of helpless tribes, extinguisher of struggling liberties. In his poem, Twain uses the image of the American flag to signal both national ideals and national dishonor. The dying president first perceives a holy vision, our flag of snow and flame far flashing in the sky, and toward it the oppressed of every clime, uplifting their poor fettered hands in hope and trust and worship. But the vision fades, to be replaced by another, in which the stars are gone, a skull and bones are in their place. The red bars are there, but soaked with guiltless blood. The white bars are black, and the dying man cries out, "Hide it from my sight." By the end of the 19th century, the American flag had become a symbol of American freedoms and American power. So it's not surprising that its image would resonate strongly with Twain. And in fact, the image of the American flag, in which the bars and the stars become evidence of shame, permeates Twain's writings for the next few years. So to the person sitting in darkness, which for those of you who've recently read it know is kind of relentlessly angry all the tone. But right towards the end, there is one paragraph that segues from fury to pathos. And here he summons the image of the flag, which he claims had been our pride, our chiefest. We have worshipped it so, and when we have seen it in far lands, glimpsing it unexpectedly in that strange sky, waving its welcome and benediction to us, we have caught our breath and uncovered our heads, and couldn't speak for a moment for the thought of what it was to us and the great ideals it stood for. Now he suggests the flag has become a monument to national dishonor. And so he again proposes that the U.S. create a flag for the Philippine territory, just our usual flag, with the white stripes painted black and the stars replaced by the skull and crossbones. Well, one reason that the flag carried so much symbolic weight for Twain was that in the history of U.S. territorial expansion up to 1899, the Constitution had always followed the flag. So prior annexations, think the Louisiana Purchase or the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, had eventuated in territories becoming states with all of the rights that citizens of states enjoyed. And Americans were taught to be proud of this tradition. According to constitutional history up to 1899, taking the flag to the Philippines would mean eventually conferring American citizenship on the Filipinos. But that is not the proposal that Congress was debating. Many of the participants in the debates balked at making Filipinos citizens. When we remember how virulent the racial situation in the U.S. was at this time, 40 years after the Civil War, 20 years since the end of Reconstruction, during a period when the Ku Klux Klan was ascendant and cities and states were fast passing segregation laws, we see how the American racial and religious landscape played into the debates over the annexation. I do not believe that there is a man here who dares to say that he would take the Filipinos as citizens of the United States, declared Mississippi's Senator Money in 1899. Does any man in the Senate say he is willing that the Filipinos shall determine the foreign and domestic policy of the United States, immediately the Filipinos will sit here, the supreme arbiters of the destinies of the American people. We want no possibility of that sort. Pennsylvania's Representative Green put it most succinctly. He opposed Filipino citizenship because we cannot make them white. We cannot make them like our citizens. For congressmen like Green, and most were like him, the United States was a white nation. They did not believe that African Americans were really citizens, despite the fact that black males were enfranchised, and they could not even conceive of Filipinos within the body politic. Over time, a series of Supreme Court decisions that became known as the insular cases redesigned the responsibilities the U.S. bore towards newly acquired territories. They solved the problem of citizenship by deciding that, in fact, the Constitution did not follow the flag. According to the court, non-contiguous territories did not have to be put into trajectory for statehood, and therefore the U.S. had no obligation to extend U.S. constitutional rights to their inhabitants. Now, the last of the insular cases was decided in 1922, which is a long time after Twain's death. But the outcry against incorporating millions of people of color into the American body politic was in full force during the last decade of his life. And you can see from this cover for the Boston Globe how the worst elements of U.S. racial discourse spilled over into the debates about the Filipinos. Here, Filipinos and American blacks are conflated into an inferior class, which is clearly incapable of acting responsibly. And I think it's the viciousness of the racial discourse that most disturbed Twain, in large part because of his own struggles to understand racial difference. And as I'm sure you know, Twain had been born into a slave-owning family in a slave-owning state, and nothing in his environment ever told him that he should regard African Americans, Chinese, or for that matter, Irishmen, Italians, or Jews as his brethren, and he didn't. His early writings reflect his environment. They are littered with racist comments. But unlike many of his compatriots, Clemens was curious and willing to learn. Also, he had a very strong instinct for social justice, and he truly hated cruelty. Living in the West taught Twain respect for the Chinese and their culture. His marriage into an abolitionist family forced him to confront his own racism about African Americans. And his 1895 tour around the world exposed him to a phenomenon rarely seen on American soil. People of color, many of them non-Christians, in positions of public authority in countries where they had been native forever. And because many of the countries that he visited were controlled by the British, he observed the effects of colonial rule both on the colonized and the colonizers. So the Twain at the turn into the 20th century was very different from the young man who had left Missouri in 1853. He understood that many anti-imperialists opposed annexation because they did not want more people of color to become U.S. citizens. He knew, and he blasted against, the epidemic of lynching that was spreading throughout the country. He knew that America's deeply ingrained racism would prevent them from ever achieving reform in the Philippines. And he was acutely uncomfortable with the discourse of Christian benevolence that masked imperial intentions. Twain understood that there was a major contradiction between Americans' desires to spread U.S. civilization around the globe and their deep-seated conviction that American civilization was not only a white Protestant invention, but in fact could only be fully enacted by white Protestants. And yet, as we've seen, the majority of Americans also felt that they had a duty to help fledgling nations to the same constitutional liberties that Americans possessed. There's a contradiction here. If American civilization was a white prerogative, what exactly did the Americans think that they were exporting, and to whom? By 1900, racial segregation was rooted in American culture, and most people believed that the races of the world stood in a hierarchical relation to each other, with whites on top. The earnest desire to plant a miniature constitution in the Pacific, as Twain phrased it, was undermined by the widespread belief that people of color were incapable of becoming American citizens. So both race and religion were central to the debates over annexation. The third factor, one that Twain was sharply aware of, was market expansion. But even here, religious language infused market imperatives. In fact, the marketplace and Protestant Christianity shared a common language. For instance, an economics text for high school students, published in 1880, argues for free trade because it reflects the biblical admonition to do unto others as you would have others do unto you. It tells students that the golden rule of Christ is full of wisdom and righteousness in its application to the intercourse of nations. We cherish the fond hope that the day is not far distant when the theory of protection will have no place, but instead the broad philanthropy which Christianity aims to make universal will have free scope to work out the world's emancipation from all wrong and evil. So here, economic theory and Protestant religion are so fully conflated that to argue against free trade is tantamount to arguing against the Sermon on the Mount. On the flip side, religious outreach could be justified as consumer capitalism. The president of the biggest missionary board in the United States suggested that spiritual changes would be reflected outwardly. When a heathen man becomes a child of God and is changed within, he wants his external life and surroundings to correspond. He wants the Christian dress and the Christian home and the Christian plow and all the other things which distinguish Christian civilization from the life of the heathen. The merchant knows that with the further spread of the gospel, business will be largely increased. So here, missionizing American material culture and capitalist expansion are one and the same. And annexation becomes a means to disseminate Christian civilization, which is defined as an American way of life in which the practice of Christianity means consumerism and civil liberty means unrestricted commerce. Historians often treat the religious language bandied about in the debates over the Philippines as a case of politicians catering to the religious lobby. But I believe that the idea of Protestant outreach framed Americans' general understanding of their presence in the island. President McKinley's famous claim that it was America's duty to civilize and Christianize the Filipinos precisely illustrates the perspective. McKinley certainly knew that the majority of Filipinos were Catholic. So his statement assumes that Catholics are not Christians, and that it was America's duty to bring Protestantism to the islands. The same assumptions are evident in a speech by Indiana Senator Albert Beveridge, who was very much in favor of U.S. market expansion in the Far East. It was our duty to annex the Philippines and to increase commerce with China, Beveridge declared, because Americans would not renounce our part in the mission of our race, trustee of God, of the civilization of the world. Well, Mark Twain called it all hogwash and pious hypocrisy. He was incensed that the Americans were using religion to mask capitalist greed. Never a coward, he vehemently refuted the claim that the American aggressions were Christian. In his salutation to the 20th century, he described the 19th century as the stately matron called Christendom, returning bedraggled, besmirched, and dishonored from pirate raids in Kiao Chau, Manchuria, South Africa, and the Philippines, her soul full of meanness, her pocket full of boodle, and her mouth full of pious hypocrisies. He wasn't only attacking the Americans for their hypocrisy. He saw the whole European imperialist game implicated. And he understood that the argument for Christian outreach was being used to sanction the division of Asia and Africa among the Western powers. In a notebook entry for 1901, written in response to the savage European repression of the Boxer Rebellion in China in 1901, Twain designed a scenario for the second advent of Christ that explicitly recognizes Christian complicity in mass destruction. Second Advent begins triumphal march around the globe at Tianjin, preceded by generals, warships, cavalry, infantry, artillery, who clear the road and pile the dead and the loot for propagation of the gospel, singing, "Where every prospect pleases and only man is vile." Christ arrives in a vast war fleet furnished by the great powers. Finally, Twain's parody of the Battle Hymn of the Republic also demonstrates his recognition that the Americans' benevolent Christian mission was simply a cover for market expansion. So you will remember the words to the final stanza of Julia Ward Howe's original, which was written during the Civil War. In the beauty of the lilies, Christ was born across the sea, with a glory in his bosom that transfigures you and me. As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free, while God is marching on. Twain's version goes like this. In sordid slime harmonious, greed was born in yonder ditch, with a longing in his bosom, and for others' goods an itch. As Christ died to make men holy, let men die to make us rich. Our God is marching on. Let me sum up here. Mark Twain's quarrel with the United States over the annexation of the Philippines is important because Twain understood the contradiction at the heart of American self-definition and perceived the morass into which it would lead us. Claiming to be harbingers of freedom to the rest of the world, celebrating the U.S. Constitution and the civil liberties it established, we also believed that our founding documents were products of and really only applicable to white Protestants. Embracing racial hierarchies, believing that only Anglo-Saxons could truly enact democracy as we had fashioned it, we nevertheless felt an evangelical mission to help the rest of the world to our unique civilization. At the same time, the language of benevolent outreach had become so intertwined with the language of consumer capitalism that foreign fields became inseparable from foreign markets. The contradictions led us into a prolonged war in the Philippines and has persisted in our dealings with the war ever since, providing the framework for the hostilities to and relations with any country that differs from us racially or religiously. As Twain's narrator muses in The Secret History of Oedipus, which is a historical fantasy written from the vantage point of the distant future, civilization is an elusive and baffling term. It is not easy to get at the precise meaning attached to it. In America and France, it seems to have meant benevolence, gentleness, godliness, justice, magnanimity, purity, love, and we gathered that men considered it a duty to confer it as a blessing upon all lowly and harmless peoples of remote regions. But as soon as it was transplanted, it became a blight, a pestilence, an awful terror. The strength of evidence seems to indicate that it was a sham at home and only laid off its disguise when abroad. Thank you.